Hello and welcome to another session on literary criticism and theory. In fact, this is our last class for the semester. So let's continue with Dr. Samuel Johnson. We are to do on his views on tragic comedy. So I want you to have a thorough understanding of the previous video because we discussed his historical methods or historical approach. We discussed his views on poetry, his views on drama, and we also discussed his views on unities. He was quite against this. He was only for the unity of plot and was completely against the unity of time and place. He found it absurd, and you also find his defense for Shakespeare. So it continues in this videos as well. Let's have a quick look into his views on tragic comedy. So see, earlier the critics had always condemned tragic comedy. Now tragic comedy was condemned by them because it mixed pain and pleasure. So that was against the classical belief. For a tragedy, it should be purely tragedy and you must not mix comedy in tragedy. So it was against the classical views. So Samuel Johnson questions this. Johnson feels that the mix of pleasure and pain in a play pleases by its variety. There is a variety in it. Because if you look at life itself, it is an intermingled yarn of both pleasure and pain. And therefore, why not bring, if life itself is an intermingled yarn of pain and pleasure together, then why not bring it into a play or in drama as well? He says that it does affect the progression of passion, and it also, or it can of course affect the power to move, because sometimes mixing comedy with tragedy can bring relief to different people differently, right? So Shakespeare, according to Johnson, Shakespeare practiced this mix of pain and pleasure together in his plays. In his plays you will find a mixture of good and evil. You will find a mixture of joy and sorrow, and that too in various proportions and also in various combinations. And this expresses in a way, when he mixes tragedy or when he mixes joy and sorrow, good and evil in various proportions and combinations, of course, it brings out, or it teaches us, or it gives us an idea of the way of the world. It gives us an idea of how the world or life as such revolves, in which you will find both pleasure and you will find loss and happiness. You will find death and life, right? So life itself is a mixed yarn of this tragedy and comedy. Comedy in the sense pleasure. Okay, in happiness, fun, where there is lack of pain, and so on. So it's a combination of both. And if you look at it, where one is mourning the death of a beloved, or when one is mourning the death of a person, in another house there would be happiness. It would be the birth, a baptism of a baby, or the birth of a child which is being rejoiced. In one section you will have, in one side when you have death, in another side you have birth. In one side, when there is pain, in another side there is happiness. In one side you have failure, on another side you have success. So it's a mixture of all these things. Thus you will find that it is similar version of Dryden. Dryden also stated the same, and Johnson's attitude to tragic comedy is also similar to that of Dryden. Okay, so now let's move on to the very famous, or his famous views on Shakespeare. Johnson's edition of Shakespeare appeared in say in 8 volumes in 1765. Okay, he edited and annotated the text, and also he wrote a preface which later becomes one of his greatest work of literary criticism. As an editor and also an annotator of Shakespeare's text, what he tried to establish was he tried to establish the text free from the earlier corruptions. There were other editions also, Shakespeare's editions before his time, but they were all loosely packed. You can say that they were not free from corruptions. They were not authentic ones. So he tried to bring in a text that is free from corruptions. And he also tried to explain the words, the vocabulary or the diction that Shakespeare used, which was almost obsolete, or which was almost a thing of the past, the word of the past, which is gone, which is not used, and which became obscure in the 18th century. That is the period of Samuel Johnson. The words that were used by Shakespeare were almost not used. Okay, so Johnson tried to explore those words, and he tried to bring clarification. So he tried to give references, or give the correct meaning to those words which were used by Shakespeare, in order to help us to familiarize with the words and to understand how these words, or why these words were used, and also his diction, Shakespeare's diction, or the words used by Shakespeare during the Elizabethan period. Now, Johnson was also working on his dictionary. The first dictionary, Dr. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which is very famous. He was working on his dictionary, that helped him a lot to gain references, or to help him to understand more about Shakespeare's diction and Shakespeare's words which he used. Now, Johnson's approach to understand Shakespeare was to immerse himself in the books Shakespeare had written, that is, the reference books that Shakespeare may have read, which helped him to write, say, Julius Caesar, or Macbeth, or the Merchant of Venice. So those books that Shakespeare perhaps may have referred to before he wrote his plays, Johnson's approach was to understand those books, and which would in fact help him to understand Shakespeare's texts. And Johnson also tried to examine the early editions of Shakespeare, both the past writings, the past editions before him, that is his predecessors, and also his contemporaries, and also the 18th century editions of Shakespeare. So he read widely. He read thoroughly the editions, the various editions of Shakespeare, the early editions of Shakespeare. Now, if you look at Johnson's annotations, or of Shakespeare's text, they are often very shrewd, and they are a careful examination of Shakespeare, and this was totally different from that of the other editions or what the other scholars wrote. വേറെ സ്കോളേഴ്സ് എഴുതിയതിൽ നിന്നും വ്യത്യസ്തമായിട്ടാണ് ജോൺസന്റെ എഡിഷൻസ് നിൽക്കുന്നത്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ജോൺസന്റെ അനോട്ടേഷൻസ് നിൽക്കുന്നത്. ഇറ്റ് വാസ് എ വെരി careful study of Shakespeare's text. And in his preface to Shakespeare, Johnson addressed several critical issues. He defends Shakespeare against the charges of failing to adhere to the neoclassical doctrine of the dramatic unities of the time and place of action. So the neoclassicals, the neoclassicists were they adhered to the classical tradition of the three unities, and most often during those times they criticized Shakespeare. That period, the neoclassical period, they often criticized Shakespeare for not adhering to the unities of time. So Johnson comes up to defend Shakespeare, and he gives that we discussed also. We discussed that in the earlier previous video as to why Johnson felt that adhering to the unity of time and adhering to the unity of place seemed absurd to him. Because those who think that the illusion of stage is very powerful, they'll have yes, the illusion of stage is powerful, but the audience know very clearly that it is just a play, and it is like underestimating the power of the audience, their imaginative capacity. And not just that, the audience over there, they can imagine any place they want. They can imagine the time to be any time. Yeah, he felt that the adhering to the unity of time and place of action was absurd, and therefore he's defending Shakespeare, saying that what Shakespeare did was right. Shakespeare never adhered to the three unities, and that's how life itself is, because he knows his audience. One other thing, he knows it's his audience. Shakespeare knew his audience well. Okay, Shakespeare had a thorough idea that of the audience capacity, the audience imaginative power, and not just that, he also had a thorough understanding of the unities, not adhering to the unities of time. Now, as we discussed in the previous video, time and place are subservient to the mind, because the audience does not confound, or they don't get mixed up with the stage action, with reality. They know well that it is just a play, and that the players are just doing their part in the play. Thus they have no trouble with a shift in the scene from Rome to Alexandria. Johnson also questions the need for purity of dramatic genres. That's what we discussed right now. Tragic comedy. Why can't we have a mix of tragedy and comedy? Right? Why do we have to adhere to this purity of dramatic genre? Okay. And he defends Shakespeare in his use of tragic comedy. Echoing Hamlet, Johnson claims that Shakespeare's merit praise above all the poet of nature. The poet holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners of life. All this we had previously discussed in the videos. Shakespeare as Ben Jonson. Who's Ben Jonson? Not Samuel Johnson. Ben Jonson was a contemporary of Shakespeare. And Ben Jonson spoke of Shakespeare as Shakespeare is not for an age but for all times. So just like that, even Samuel Johnson feels the same, because he feels that his plays are not for an age but for all ages. It has a universal effect. Dr. Johnson also says that if we look at the characters of other writers, they are often too individual. But if you look at the characters of Shakespeare's stories, they are common species of humanity, a type. He also says that Shakespeare has no heroes. His are occupied only by men. Now what does that mean? See, this is based on a previous notion of by Voltaire, where people like Voltaire, they believed that a hero should, or if the hero should never be similar to that of the lesser characters. If a king is the hero, then the king must not be similar to the common man. He would not allow, Voltaire was against portraying kings as drunkards or the senators as buffoons. That is, the heroes were the ones with, they were not similar to the common man, or their errors, their frailties was not touched upon. But in Johnson's opinion, Shakespeare does not hold this view. Shakespeare was not interested in the Romanness of Julius Caesar or that of Brutus, and instead he points out the traits, the weaknesses that are common to humanity, to all humanity. If you look at Julius Caesar, his flaw, his weakness of falling for flattery is pointed out. That is a very universal thing. Then Brutus' blindness adhering to democracy, that his love for democracy, his love for republic was the main reason why he killed Caesar, why he took sides with his enemies and his assassins, and killed Caesar. And also Cassius, you will find that kind of crooked people, the ones who are jealous of a particular person and wants to see him fall. So if you look at all these characters, you will find that the hero, especially Julius Caesar, you will find in Julius Caesar that he's not hailed as a hero, but instead there is that the frailties and the weakness of any man, the common man's frailties. Anybody who falls for a flattery, that common nature is portrayed very clearly. So that's why Johnson says he has no heroes. So his scenes are all occupied by men, a man, as of man who is prone to frailties, or who is prone to the universal frailties of life. Now Johnson is the first among the great Shakespearean critic to stress on the playwright's sound understanding of human nature. Johnson's focus on character analysis paved way for a critical trend in Shakespeare's criticism itself. You have S.T. Coleridge, you have Charles Lamb, you have A.C. Bradley. They were all greatly influenced by Samuel Johnson, especially his preface to Shakespeare. Now, preface to Shakespeare again is first and foremost a very significant one, because of its practical application of critical principle that Johnson used consistently, and also that is that comparison method. His attempt to measure Shakespeare against others, both the classical as well as contemporary, became the model for others. That comparison method became a model for others. Secondly, Preface to Shakespeare exemplifies Johnson's belief that good criticism can be produced only after good scholarship has been practiced. That is, you need to be a good scholar in order to criticize. The critic who wishes to judge or criticize an author, the author's contributions or the author's work to the tradition must first and foremost have a thorough understanding of the A to Z of literature. When I'm understanding, he should have a thorough reading, he should have a thorough research and a very sound knowledge of literature of the past and of the present. And only then he will be able to understand whatever has been borrowed into literature and whatever has been invented. So to criticize or to evaluate an author, one should have a thorough knowledge of literature. And now we come to the biographical criticism, or the biographical criticism, Johnson's views on biographical criticism. Johnson was the first English critic to attempt a systematic work in his Lives of the Poet. Now, it is a historical cum critical account of 52 poets from Abraham Cowley to Thomas Gray, covering a period of say 100 years. It can be considered both as a history of English poetry and a work of criticism. It is one with Shakespeare's Preface, which portrays Johnson's power to lay bare the characteristic quality of each poet. He shows the characteristic quality of each poet that he discusses in his Lives of Poet. The best written of these lives are those of Cowley, Abraham Cowley, Milton, Dryden, Addison and Pope. His biography of Cowley is remarkable for its definition of the metaphysical school of poets, which began with Donne and ended with Cowley. Johnson, however, was not for the metaphysical poet. He disliked them. He does not hide his displeasure at the kind of poetry. What he tries to do in the Lives of Poets on the metaphysical poet is he tries to bring out the characteristics of the metaphysical poets clearly. He introduces all the characteristics of the metaphysical poets, their conceits, their hyperbole and all that. But he does not approve of any of them. And also if you look at Milton, or meaning his views on Milton, even Milton's grandeur, his Milton style is noted as the power of displaying the vast, illuminating the splendid, enforcing the awful, darkening the gloomy and aggravating the dreadful. You will also find that Johnson had his likes. All this was good, but there were also some prejudices, especially his attack on Milton's Lycidas. We discussed that also in the previous video. So he attacked Milton's Lycidas as being very artificial. Dryden, his views on Dryden is that Dryden is similar to a poet who taught men to think naturally and express forcibly. And Dryden as a critic was all about to determine, or he determined all the principles and the merits of composition. He analyzed, or he tried to evaluate what makes an author special, his evaluation of an author. So as a critic, Dryden tries to determine all the good principles that an author would need, that would make him or her a good writer. And his views on Addison is that of a describer of life and manners and a teacher of wisdom rather than a poet or a critic. So Addison, more than a poet and a critic, he considers his views on Addison is that of a describer of life and manners, a man who describes life and manners, a teacher of wisdom. That's how he considers Addison. And also, if you look at Addison's prose, becomes a model of the middle style, and it is familiar but not coarse. It is elegant but not ostentatious. So that his Addison's prose is one that deserves, according to Samuel Johnson, Addison's prose is one that deserves a close study. Okay, and finally he comes to that of Alexander Pope, and he calls Alexander Pope a genius in whom all the qualities that are essential for a genius is, stored. So he considers Pope a genius. So that's all for on Samuel Johnson. Thank you and keep safe.